Chapter 12, in-class notes. This part of the notes is going to focus on how to collect biased samples and bad samples. The most common way to collect a bad sample is with something called a voluntary response sample. This is when respondents choose to be included in a survey. Take, for example, when you're on the internet and you see one of those links that says, click here to give your opinion of the president. The only people who actually click that link are people who are strongly in favor or strongly opposed to the president. No one who's indifferent is going to think, meh, let me go through and spend a few minutes giving my opinion. Voluntary response samples are almost always biased, so conclusions drawn from them are almost always wrong. This is the most common way to collect a bad sample. You hear them all the time, calling in to radio stations, calling into TV stations, that type of thing. They're often biased towards those with strong opinions, so those people are overweighted, and the people with opinions that are kind of mediocre in between, in the middle there, don't call in, don't give their opinion, so they're missing or undercovered in the survey. Voluntary response samples, it's both a bias and a type of sampling. Another way that we can sample poorly is by conducting something called a convenience sample. When we conduct a convenience sample, we contact individuals who are easy to obtain responses from. Let's say I want to sample my students and find out how many hours on average they're working after the school day ends. But rather than take a random sample of all of my students, I just decide to ask the first 20 students that I see in the morning. This group is probably not representative of all my students, especially if these students who do work need some extra sleep, so they arrive a bit later than this earlier group who I'm more likely to see first. For these next two types of biases, let's apply it to presidential elections. So in this example, we're polling for the next election. We ask all adults across the United States, who do you plan to vote for president? Well, this is what's called a bad sampling frame because all adults are not registered for the election. We're polling people who are actually not our target audience. Okay, so to be more precise, we would want to make sure that they are registered voters. Okay, so we switch over and we make sure all of our subjects in our sample are registered voters. Well, this is still a bad sampling frame because not all registered voters are likely voters. Now we have to figure out which of these voters that we're contacting are actually going to show up on election day or mail in an absentee ballot to vote for their preferred candidate. Okay, political polling can be tricky to figure out what your actual sampling frame is. Who are the people who are actually going to be voting? There's also something called undercoverage, which is when there's groups that are underrepresented or missing from our sample. Sticking with presidential polling, let's say we do a random sample of people across the United States, but we don't get enough people from the Midwest. Okay, that's a very key area, especially right now. We want to make sure that we're not missing out on any subsection of the population when we do any kind of sampling. Here we just have a few other types of biases. On this top one, non-response bias. Let's say we're conducting our sample door to door. So we're out in a neighborhood knocking on doors. We're asking them, who are you planning on voting for president? Some of the people we go to knock on the door, they don't answer. Maybe they're not home. Maybe they just choose to ignore us. But we go on and we just collect responses from anyone who does answer. The problem is that the people who are giving us answers and the people who are not are likely different. Okay, maybe the people we're missing are all at work. Is it during the workday? Is it a Saturday night? Or are we missing young people? Are we more likely to get old people if it's a workday when a lot of the younger population is out working? So make sure we don't have non-response bias, missing data. Okay, response bias is when the wording of our question actually steers people to give a specific answer.